My granddaughter called me at 2 in the morning, her voice choking on tears. "Grandpa, help me," she sobbed into the receiver. "I am at the police station. My stepmother beat me, but she told them I attacked her. And Dad believes her, not me." When I walked through the doors of the 4th Precinct 20 minutes later, the duty captain took one look at me and went pale. "Sir," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic, "I did not know she was calling you. If you are listening to this story, take a deep breath." What started as a seemingly typical teenage rebellion against a stepmother quickly unraveled into the most chilling, cold-blooded crime I have ever witnessed in my 40 years on the judge's bench. Never underestimate the protective instincts of a grandfather, and never cross a man who spent his entire life putting the most dangerous criminals in the country behind bars. I am William Crawford, 70 years old, a retired Superior Court judge living in the quiet suburbs of Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up for a family member when no one else would. Life after retirement was supposed to be quiet. My wife passed away a decade ago, and my world revolved around my son Matthew and his daughter Lily. Matthew is a brilliant orthopedic surgeon, a man I raised to be compassionate and fiercely intelligent. When his first wife died in a tragic car accident 4 years ago, it shattered our family. I stepped in helping Matthew raise Lily through those dark years. We were a tight-knit trio until Stephanie entered the picture. She was a luxury real estate agent who sold Matthew his new mansion in Lincoln Park. Stephanie was 32, beautiful, highly manipulative, and relentlessly charming. They married barely a year after meeting. I always kept a polite distance, giving them space to build their new life, but I never fully trusted her smiles. They never quite reached her eyes. The freezing winds of a brutal Chicago winter were howling outside my window that night. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:15 when the jarring ring of my cell phone shattered the silence. I reached for it blindly expecting an emergency call from an old colleague. Instead, I heard the hyperventilating, terrified gasps of my 15-year-old granddaughter. "Grandpa," she gasped, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "You have to come get me. Please hurry." "Lily," I said. Sitting up instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Take a deep breath." "Where are you?" "What is going on? I am at the police station," she cried, her voice echoing in what sounded like a busy hallway. "Stephanie locked me in the basement. She hurt me, Grandpa. But when the police came, she told them I was the one who attacked her with scissors. Dad is here, but he will not even look at me. He thinks I am crazy. Please come." I did not ask another question. I told her I was on my way, threw on my heavy wool coat over my clothes, and grabbed my keys. The drive from my suburban home to the 4th Precinct downtown was a blur of adrenaline and cold rage. I pushed my car to its limits, speeding through red lights on empty intersections. Lily was a gentle, quiet girl, an honor student who spent weekends painting. The idea of her attacking anyone with a weapon was absurd. But the detail that terrified me most was Matthew. Why was my son, a fiercely protective father, refusing to listen to his own child? I slammed the brakes in front of the precinct and pushed through the heavy glass double doors into the chaotic fluorescent-lit lobby. The air smelled of stale coffee and tension. Suspects were handcuffed to metal benches while officers typed furiously at their desks. It was an environment I knew intimately, a world I had presided over for 4 decades. I walked straight toward the front desk. A rookie cop looking no older than 25 stepped into my path and held up his hand. "Hold on, sir," the rookie barked, puffing out his chest with unearned authority. "You cannot just storm in here. Take a number and wait in the seating area until your name is called." I did not break my stride. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dangerously low. "My name is William Crawford. You have my granddaughter, Lily Crawford, in a holding room. I am here to take her home. I suggest you get out of my way before I make your commanding officer explain why you are obstructing a retired Superior Court judge." The rookie sneered, clearly not recognizing me. Look, buddy, I do not care if you are the mayor. We have protocols here. You need to step back. Before he could finish, the heavy wooden door behind the desk swung open, and the duty captain rushed out. I knew him well. Captain Miller was a seasoned veteran who had testified in my courtroom a dozen times. When his tired eyes landed on me, the color drained entirely from his face. He froze before quickly shoving the arrogant rookie aside. Judge Crawford. Captain Miller stammered, rushing around the desk to greet me. Sir, I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea she was your granddaughter. The arresting officers just brought her in. I did not know she was calling you. The rookie cop turned pale, instantly shrinking back against the wall as he realized his massive mistake. Save the apologies, Captain, I said coldly. I want to see her right now, and you are going to explain to me exactly why a straight A student with zero criminal record is sitting in a police station in the middle of the night instead of her own bed. Yes, sir. Right this way, please, Miller said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He led me past the front desk, down a narrow hallway, lined with interrogation rooms. The ambient noise faded behind the heavy security doors. As we walked, my stomach churned with a sickening sense of dread. The captain's nervous demeanor told me the situation was far worse than a simple family dispute. We stopped between two adjacent rooms with large one-way observation windows. She is in room 3. Judge, the captain whispered, gesturing to the door on the left. The stepmother and your son are in room 4. I turned my head to look through the thick observation glass, and the disturbing sight that instantly met my eyes made the blood in my veins run completely cold. I stood frozen in the dark, silent corridor, struggling to process the absolute nightmare unfolding before me. In that single terrifying moment, observing the two brightly lit rooms, I realized that my family had been infiltrated by a ruthless monster, and my son was completely under her incredibly toxic, dangerous spell. I knew I had to completely destroy her to save them. The heavy steel door of observation room 3 felt like ice under my palm as I stepped quietly into the narrow, darkened viewing space. Through the thick one-way glass, the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast a sickly pale glow over everything inside. There, sitting entirely alone at a scarred metal table, was my 15-year-old granddaughter. Lily was curled tightly into herself, her knees pulled up to her chest, shaking violently despite the heavy wool police blanket someone had draped over her thin shoulders. She looked so incredibly small, so terrifyingly fragile, a stark contrast to the bright, vibrant girl who used to paint landscapes in my backyard just a few months ago. I pressed my hand firmly against the cold glass, an overwhelming wave of paternal grief and raw fury tightening my chest. Her lower lip was split and swollen, a thin dark line of dried blood trailing slowly down her chin. But it was her delicate wrists that made the breath catch painfully in my throat. As she reached up a trembling hand to wipe a tear from her cheek, the gray police blanket slipped down, revealing dark, angry purple bruises wrapping completely around her delicate forearms. They were distinct, unmistakable finger marks. Someone had grabbed her with brutal, terrifying force, the sickening grip of a predator. My jaw clenched so hard my back teeth ached. I had sentenced violent abusers to decades in maximum security state prisons for far lesser injuries. Seeing those hideous marks on my own flesh and blood ignited a primal, almost blinding rage deep within my soul. I wanted nothing more than to break down that steel door, wrap her tightly in my arms, and assure her that no one would ever lay a hand on her again. She stared blankly at the cold concrete wall, her eyes completely hollowed out by fear and sheer exhaustion, entirely stripped of the sweet innocence she possessed just hours prior. It took every ounce of judicial restraint I had carefully cultivated over 40 years not to march straight into the adjacent room and tear it apart with my bare hands. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to take a step back, to shift my focus from the traumatized victim to the ruthless perpetrators. I walked out of the viewing area for room 3 and moved slowly toward the heavy door of room 4. I stepped into the darkness of the second observation space, crossing my arms tightly over my chest as I peered intently through the thick glass. The extreme contrast between the two rooms was so sharp, so deeply revolting, that it felt exactly like a physical blow to my stomach. In this room, there was absolutely no shivering, traumatized teenager. Instead, sitting comfortably upright in a padded office chair, was Stephanie, putting on a dramatic performance that would have easily won her a dozen Academy Awards. She was leaning gracefully over the table, sobbing delicately into a pristine white tissue, her shoulders shaking in a perfectly calculated rhythm of fake distress. She held her left arm up high as if it were severely broken, lightly, dabbing at a superficial, barely visible scratch near her elbow. It was the kind of shallow, minor scrape you might get from casually brushing past a rosebush. Yet she cradled it like a mortal bleeding wound. Every few seconds, she would dab her completely dry eyes, peek out carefully from beneath her manicured eyelashes to ensure the precinct detective in the room was actively watching her, and then instantly resume her theatrical weeping. I had spent my entire adult life sitting high on the bench, watching professional liars, seasoned con artists, and master manipulators perform on the witness stand. I knew the subtle hidden tells of a fabricated emotion. The absolute lack of real tears, the constant checking of the captive audience, the over-exaggerated physical posture of pure victimhood. Stephanie was certainly not a victim. She was a highly skilled predator, flawlessly executing a carefully rehearsed script. I watched her softly dab that pathetic little scratch, once again, effortlessly playing the role of the traumatized, loving stepmother, pushed to the breaking point by a supposedly violent teenage girl. It was completely sickening to witness. She was actively weaving a complex web of lies designed to utterly destroy a 15-year-old child, and she was doing it with the cold, effortless grace of a true psychopath. But the intense anger I felt toward her manipulative performance instantly evaporated into a deep, paralyzing horror when my eyes finally shifted away from her and landed on the man sitting quietly beside her. It was my own son, Matthew. I had to blink hard and take a shaky step closer to the glass, my mind rejecting the horrifying image sitting before me. This could not be my strong son. Matthew was a brilliant, highly sought-after orthopedic surgeon. I was a vigorous man who ran marathons on the weekends, who successfully operated for 14 hours straight, with steady hands and razor-sharp mental focus. The broken man sitting quietly beside Stephanie looked exactly like a walking corpse. He was slumped far forward in a cheap plastic chair, his spine curved drastically like an old tired man carrying an unbearable heavy weight on his back. His skin, usually flush with healthy color, was now a terrifying shade of ashen gray, stretched uncomfortably tight over his prominent cheekbones. Deep dark purplish circles hollowed out the space beneath his eyes, making them look completely sunken and entirely lifeless. He was staring blankly down at the dirty linoleum floor, his jaw hanging slightly slack, completely devoid of the sharp, bright intellect and vibrant physical energy that always defined him. When Stephanie let out a particularly loud, dramatic fake sob, Matthew flinched, but it was a delayed, incredibly lethargic reaction. He slowly raised his heavy arm, his hand trembling visibly, even from behind the thick glass, and gently placed it on her shoulder. He patted her back with the clumsy, uncoordinated movements of someone heavily sedated. He did not look angry at the situation. He did not look conflicted about his daughter. He looked entirely vacant, a hollow, empty shell of the strong, protective father I once knew. He was blindly comforting the deceitful woman sitting beside him, completely ignoring the horrific fact that his own beautiful daughter was bleeding and shivering alone in a cold cell just a few feet away. My old heart shattered into 1,000 jagged, broken pieces. How had I not seen this happening? I had definitely noticed he looked incredibly tired during our brief phone calls over the past few difficult months, but he had always quickly blamed it on grueling, endless hospital shifts. I had believed him completely. I had foolishly trusted his easy excuses because he was a highly respected medical doctor. But what I was seeing tonight was absolutely not normal fatigue. This was profound, systemic physical deterioration. He looked exactly as though a toxic poison was slowly eating away at him from the inside out, ruthlessly stripping him of his brilliant mind, his physical vitality, and his natural protective parental instincts. Captain Miller gently touched my shoulder, pulling me away from the thick observation glass. His face was grim, heavily etched with the kind of deep exhaustion that only decades in law enforcement can bring. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Judge Crawford," he began, his voice dropping to a low, respectful whisper. "The arresting officers responded to a frantic domestic disturbance call at your son's residence. The stepmother claims that Lily experienced a violent, unprovoked, psychotic episode. She stated that Lily threatened her life and aggressively attacked her. The charge they are processing right now is aggravated assault with a deadly weapon against a family member. The weapon in question is a pair of heavy gardening scissors." I turned to look at the seasoned captain, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the horrific words leaving his mouth. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. It was a charge designed for hardened, violent criminals, not a sensitive 15-year-old girl who spent her weekends painting watercolor landscapes and volunteering at the local animal shelter. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. "Captain," I said, maintaining unyielding eye contact, "you and I both know that my granddaughter is not a violent criminal. I am going into that room right now, and I am going to speak with her alone. There will be no precinct detectives present. There will be no recorded interrogation. I am acting as her legal counsel and her guardian." Captain Miller simply nodded silently, stepping aside and gesturing toward the heavy steel door. He knew better than to argue with a man who had dedicated his entire life to dismantling false narratives in a court of law. I gripped the cold metal handle, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the stark, freezing interrogation room. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, completely sealing us off from the noisy, chaotic precinct outside. Lily flinched violently at the sound of the door closing, pulling the gray police blanket tighter around her fragile, trembling shoulders. When her tear-filled eyes finally looked up and met mine, a heartbreaking sob escaped her bruised lips. "Grandpa," she cried out, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered agony. I closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, completely ignoring the metal table, and knelt down on the hard linoleum floor beside her chair. I wrapped my arms securely around her shaking body, pulling her into a tight, protective embrace. "I am right here, sweetheart," I whispered softly, gently stroking her tangled dark hair. "You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you ever again. I promise you that." She buried her face into my heavy wool coat, sobbing uncontrollably. I held her for a long time, patiently letting her release the immense, terrifying pressure of the night. I could feel the rapid, frantic beating of her small heart against my chest. As she slowly began to calm down, I gently pulled back and looked directly into her swollen, bloodshot eyes. I carefully took her small, bruised hands in mine, making sure not to press on the dark purple finger marks wrapping completely around her delicate wrists. "Lily, I need you to look at me," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm, steady, and full of unconditional love. "I know you did not attack anyone. I know you are a good, gentle girl. But I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight in that house. I need the absolute truth so I can protect you." She took a shaky, uneven breath, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her pale cheeks. She squeezed my hands tightly, her gaze darting nervously toward the observation mirror, as if she knew the monster was sitting somewhere nearby. "She lied to them," Grandpa, Lily whispered, her voice trembling with profound trauma. "I did not attack her. I never even touched her. It was the basement. She knows how terrified I am of the dark, tight spaces." I nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. I knew very well about her severe claustrophobia. It was a crippling anxiety condition that had developed shortly after she tragically lost her biological mother. tight, enclosed spaces sent her into absolute blinding panic attacks. Dad was asleep again. Lily continued her words, tumbling out in a desperate, frantic rush. He is always sleeping now. He never wakes up when I need him. Stephanie got mad at me because I accidentally dropped a glass in the kitchen. It was just a stupid accident, but she completely lost her mind. She grabbed me by the arm so hard I thought my bones were going to snap. She dragged me down the hallway. I was screaming for my dad, but he never came. She shoved me down the stairs into the basement and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. She locked it from the outside. My blood ran cold. The basement in that massive historic Lincoln Park mansion was a soundproofed windowless concrete vault. It was a terrifying pitch-black abyss. Locking a severely claustrophobic child inside that dark underground space was not just cruel discipline. It was pure, calculated psychological torture. It was so dark, Grandpa, she sobbed, her whole body shaking violently at the horrific memory. I could not see my own hands. I could not breathe. The walls felt like they were shrinking and crushing me. I was pounding on the door, begging her to let me out. I promised I would be good. I promised I would clean up the glass. But she just laughed. I heard her laughing right on the other side of the heavy door. I closed my eyes for a brief second, fighting back a surge of violent, blinding anger. What happened next, Lily? I asked softly, gently wiping a fresh tear from her cheek. I panicked, she whispered, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless pitch. I felt around in the total darkness on the workbench near the stairs. I found a pair of heavy metal gardening scissors. I did not want to hurt anyone. I swear I did not. I just wanted to pry the lock open. I shoved the metal blades into the doorframe and pushed as hard as I could. I was crying and pulling on the handle. Then suddenly, she unlocked the door. The bright hallway light blinded me. I stumbled forward, still holding the scissors, because my hands were shaking too much to drop them. Stephanie did not even look scared. She just stood there with this horrible, evil smile on her face. She looked at the scissors, and then she looked right into my eyes. She reached out, grabbed her own arm, and dragged her sharp fingernails down her skin until it bled. Then she dropped to the floor and started screaming for help. She called the police and told them I tried to murder her. The sheer, calculated malice of her actions left me completely stunned. She had orchestrated this entire horrific nightmare to perfectly frame and completely destroy a helpless 15-year-old girl without a single trace of human empathy or guilt. I left Lily wrapped safely in the gray police blanket, promising to return soon. I instructed the captain to post an officer outside her door, then turned my attention to the adjacent room. My heart pounded with calculated rage as I pushed the heavy door open. The atmosphere was thick with the suffocating scent of stale coffee and cheap perfume. Matthew did not look up when the door slammed shut. He remained slumped in his plastic chair, staring blankly at the floor, his breathing shallow and incredibly labored. Stephanie, however, reacted instantly. When she saw me step into the light, her entire posture shifted. She abandoned the quiet victim routine I observed earlier, and immediately threw herself into the role of a tormented, desperately loving mother seeking solace. "Oh, William," she cried, her voice cracking with modulated sorrow. She stood up, rushing toward me to collapse into my arms. I simply held up my hand, a silent barrier stopping her dead in her tracks. She blinked, looking confused by my cold reception, but quickly recovered. She cradled her left arm, carefully showcasing the superficial scratch near her elbow. "I am so sorry you were pulled out of bed for this nightmare," she whimpered, dabbing her cheek with a tissue. "We tried so hard to handle this privately, but tonight Lily simply crossed a line we could no longer manage. She tried to kill me, William. She genuinely tried to kill me." I kept my expression entirely neutral, folding my arms across my coat. I stared at her, allowing the deafening silence to stretch on for an uncomfortable amount of time. I spent decades presiding over criminal trials, knowing that silence was often the most effective weapon against a liar. People like Stephanie hate silence. It forces them to fill the void, inevitably making them overplay their hand. When I refused to offer comforting words, she cleared her throat and launched directly into her carefully constructed narrative. "You must understand how difficult these past few months have been for us," Stephanie began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "We have been trying to protect Lily from her own destructive actions. Since the tragic anniversary of her mother's death, she has been spiraling out of control. It started with minor behavioral issues, skipping classes and hiding in her room. Then she fell in with a horrible crowd at school. Troubled kids. They introduced her to drugs. William, we found marijuana hidden in her backpack last month, and we strongly suspect she is experimenting with harder synthetic substances." She paused, glancing down at Matthew for confirmation. Matthew slowly nodded his head, a sluggish movement that looked entirely mechanical. "Yes, Dad." Matthew mumbled, his voice slurred and painfully weak. "She is out of control. We do not know what to do anymore." I looked at my son, a brilliant surgeon, who sounded like a man drowning in a chemical fog. I forced myself to focus back on Stephanie, gesturing for her to continue. The drugs completely fractured her fragile mental state. Stephanie continued, placing a protective hand on his drooping shoulder. "She experiences severe drug-induced psychotic episodes. She hallucinates. She becomes incredibly paranoid and violently aggressive. We live in absolute terror, walking on eggshells in our own home. We did not want to burden you with this dark secret because we know how much you adore her. We thought we could fix it with love and patience. But tonight, she completely lost her mind. She started screaming about imaginary monsters, smashing dishes in the kitchen, and tearing the house apart. When I tried to calm her down, she grabbed those heavy gardening scissors and lunged at my throat. I watched her perform, analyzing every single microscopic detail of her physical delivery. Her voice wavered at the exact right moments. Her breathing hitched perfectly to simulate panic. She was spinning a highly plausible lie, a tragic but completely believable narrative of a grieving teenage girl turning to substance abuse and suffering a violent mental breakdown. It was a story the precinct detectives would readily swallow, especially when corroborated by a respected medical doctor like Matthew. But I needed her to explain the basement. I needed to hear how she would justify locking a severely claustrophobic child in a pitch-black underground vault. "And the basement?" I asked, my tone flat and devoid of any emotion. "Lily told me you locked her in the basement." Stephanie let out a tragic, long-suffering sigh, shaking her head as if burdened by an impossible parental duty. William, it is not just a basement," she explained, her tone shifting to one of earnest, pleading sincerity. "It is a carefully modified, padded acoustic sensory room. Matthew and I spent a fortune renovating that space specifically for Lily. When she suffers these violent psychotic breaks, she becomes a massive danger to herself and to us. We cannot simply let her run into the streets or destroy the house. The sensory room is designed to completely isolate her from stimulating triggers. It is soundproofed and safe. We only placed her in there tonight to give her a chance to calm down and detox from whatever substance she had taken. We were trying to protect her from hurting herself. We only locked the door because she was wildly wielding a deadly weapon." She looked up at me, offering a fragile, trembling smile of utter exhaustion. "We are just trying to be good parents, William," she whispered. "We are just trying to save your granddaughter from destroying her own life." I stood absolutely motionless, absorbing the intricate, perfectly polished tapestry of deceit she had just woven. It was a masterful defense. She had an answer for everything. She had weaponized Lily's grief, fabricated a drug addiction, and rebranded a dark, concrete torture chamber into a therapeutic medical sanctuary. She had painted herself as the selfless, bleeding martyr, desperately trying to save a violent, unhinged teenager. To any ordinary observer, to any overworked precinct detective, her story would seem absolutely flawless. But my internal lie detector, honed over thousands of hours in a high-stakes courtroom, was screaming with deafening clarity. I stared directly into her eyes, looking past the trembling lips and the carefully dabbed tissues. I looked deep into the core of the woman standing before me. When people cry genuine tears of sorrow or experience real physical terror, the emotion takes over their entire face. The eyes swell, the facial muscles spasm involuntarily. The gaze becomes unfocused and desperate. Stephanie was shedding tears, but those tears stopped abruptly at her cheekbones. Her eyes were completely dry, sharp, and terrifyingly cold. There was absolutely no fear in those dark pupils. There was no maternal grief. There was only a rigid, calculating intelligence, actively monitoring my reactions, constantly, assessing whether her intricate lies were successfully penetrating my defenses. She was studying me with the detached, analytical focus of a predator watching a potential threat. In that fleeting, silent exchange of glances, the heavy, suffocating veil of her deception was entirely lifted for me. I saw her exactly for what she truly was. She was a deeply psychopathic manipulator executing her malicious secret agenda. I shifted my gaze away from the woman standing before me and focused entirely on my son. Matthew had barely moved since I entered the room. I stepped closer, my heart aching with every step. Up close, his condition was even more alarming. The sharp, confident surgeon, who used to command operating rooms with absolute precision, was gone. He looked like a man wading through a thick, invisible swamp. "Matthew," I said softly, crouching down slightly to catch his eye. "Do you hear what she is saying about your daughter? Do you understand what has happened tonight?" Matthew blinked slowly, as if my words had to travel a great distance to reach his brain. He wet his dry, cracked lips and let out a long, ragged exhale. "Dad," he muttered, his speech thick and heavily slurred. "You do not see what it is like at home. Stephanie is trying. She is trying so hard to keep our family together. Lily is sick, Dad. She is really sick." The words tumbled out of his mouth in a clumsy, uncoordinated mess. He dragged a trembling hand across his pale forehead, leaving a faint streak of sweat behind. His movements were disturbingly sluggish. He did not sound like a father protecting his child. He sounded like a hostage repeating a script he had been forced to memorize. I felt a surge of panic mixed with profound sadness. This was not normal exhaustion. His eyes lacked focus. His pupils were dilated. He was heavily medicated under the influence of something powerful enough to suppress his natural paternal instincts. I tried to reach him, to find the son I raised beneath that terrifying chemical fog. "Matthew, look at me," I pleaded, keeping my voice firm but gentle. "Lily is sitting in a holding cell. She is covered in bruises. She is terrified of the dark, and your wife locked her in a basement. How can you possibly justify that?" He shook his head, a weak, pathetic gesture of surrender. "You do not get it," he slurred, leaning heavily against the metal table for support. "We had to contain her. She was a danger to herself. Stephanie was just protecting us." Stephanie stepped forward, placing a gentle, proprietary hand on his slumped shoulder. "See, William," she whispered, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. "We are completely exhausted. We are out of options. We simply cannot manage her violent outbursts anymore." Matthew nodded sluggishly, in agreement with her lie. "We made a decision, Dad," he murmured, his heavy eyelids drooping as he struggled to stay awake. "It breaks my heart, but it is for her own good. We are submitting the paperwork on Monday. We are going to admit Lily into a long-term adolescent psychiatric facility out in the suburbs. They have the resources to deal with her addiction and her violent psychosis. She needs professional inpatient treatment. We just cannot keep her in the house anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A long-term psychiatric facility. They were planning to lock a perfectly sane, grieving 15-year-old girl inside a mental institution. The thought of it was completely unbearable to me. Once a minor is involuntarily committed under those pretenses, extracting them becomes a massive, agonizing legal nightmare. They would pump her full of real antipsychotic drugs. They would destroy her future, her mind, and her spirit. and they were going to do it in less than 48 hours. I looked at Matthew, trying to find a trace of hesitation, but there was none. He was completely detached from the horrific reality of his own words. He truly believed he was doing the right thing, his mind so entirely warped by whatever substance was currently poisoning his system. I realized then that arguing with him was completely useless. I had to change my tactics immediately. I had to get Lily out of their grasp tonight before the weekend ended, before they could file those irreversible commitment papers on Monday morning. I stood up straight, pulling my coat tightly around my shoulders. I drew upon every ounce of commanding authority I had wielded during my 4 decades on the judicial bench. The time for emotional pleading was over. I was now operating strictly as a judge and a fiercely protective grandfather. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, resonant octave that commanded absolute silence in the small room. "I am taking Lily home with me tonight. She will stay at my house for the duration of the weekend to completely de-escalate this situation." Matthew blinked, looking confused, but he did not have the energy to mount a protest. Stephanie, however, immediately stiffened. "William, I do not think that is a good idea," she countered smoothly. "She is highly unstable. What if she attacks you in your sleep? She needs to be under strict supervision." "She will be under the strict supervision of a former Superior Court judge," I replied, staring her down with unyielding intensity. "Given the conflicting statements and the lack of substantial evidence regarding her alleged attack, the police are releasing her into my temporary custody. There will be no charges filed tonight. She is coming with me, and that is not a request. It is a non-negotiable fact." I watched Stephanie quickly run the calculus in her mind. She realized that fighting a retired judge in a police precinct filled with officers who respected him was a losing battle. She needed to maintain her facade of the caring, overwhelmed mother. Her posture instantly softened. She let out a dramatic sigh of relief. "Oh, William, thank you," she breathed out, her voice fluttering with fake gratitude. "Matthew and I desperately need a few days of peace to recover from this nightmare. If you think you can handle her safely, we would be so incredibly grateful. Please take her for the weekend. Let things calm down. We just want what is best for our family." I simply nodded once, remaining silent. I turned my back on them, gripping the heavy metal door handle to leave the interrogation room and gather my granddaughter. But as I pushed the door open, my gaze caught the reflection in the thick, one-way observation glass mounted on the wall. The lighting created a crystal-clear mirror effect against the dark glass. I paused for a second, resting heavily on the doorframe, and looked at the reflection of the woman standing behind me. What I saw in that brief, terrifying moment will haunt me for the rest of my days. The moment my back was turned, the tragic weeping stepmother completely vanished. Her hands dropped away from her supposedly injured arm. The fake tears ceased instantly, and on her face was a look of such pure, unadulterated malice that it chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. She was staring at the back of my head with a dead, victorious, psychopathic smirk. She thought I was taking the bait, removing the troublesome teenager from the house just in time for her to execute the final deadly phase of her grand master plan. The drive back to my home in the quiet suburbs was shrouded in a heavy, tense silence. Lily sat huddled in the passenger seat of my car, staring blankly out the window at the passing streetlights. I kept a close eye on her, analyzing her physical state with the objective scrutiny of a man who had spent decades observing addicts. According to Stephanie, my granddaughter was in the throes of a severe drug addiction and violent psychosis. Yet as the minutes ticked by, I saw absolutely zero signs of chemical withdrawal. There were no tremors, no manic sweating, no erratic twitches or paranoid delusions. There was only the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a teenager who had been pushed past her breaking point. When we finally pulled into my driveway, the digital clock on my dashboard read 4 in the morning. I led her inside, turning on the soft, warm lights of the hallway to chase away the freezing darkness. I told her she was safe, that my home was a fortress, and no one would ever take her from me. She offered a small, fragile nod, wrapping her arms tightly around her waist as we walked slowly up the wooden staircase toward the guest bedroom. I turned down the bed covers and brought her a set of clean, comfortable clothes. "You need to get some sleep, sweetheart," I said softly. "I will be right down the hall if you need absolutely anything." I stepped out into the corridor and placed my hand on the brass doorknob, slowly pulling the heavy wooden door shut to give her some much-needed privacy. The moment the door began to close, narrowing the gap of light from the hallway, a sudden, terrifying scream ripped through the silence of the house. Lily lunged forward, her hands slamming violently against the wood to stop the door from shutting. "Please," she gasped, her chest heaving as she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Please do not close it. Do not lock me in. I cannot breathe in the dark." I froze, stepping immediately back into the room and leaving the door wide open. I watched as she collapsed onto the edge of the mattress, clutching her chest and gasping for air. This was not the reaction of a rebellious teenager throwing a tantrum. This was a severe, crippling manifestation of clinical claustrophobia. Stephanie had confidently claimed the basement was a padded sensory room designed to soothe my granddaughter. But seeing Lily hyperventilate at the mere sight of a closing bedroom door completely obliterated that disgusting lie. Locking a claustrophobic child in a pitch-black underground vault was a calculated act of extreme psychological warfare intended to break her spirit completely. I quickly realized that sleep was going to be entirely impossible for her right now. "Come with me," I said gently, offering my outstretched hand. "Let us go downstairs for a while." We walked down the staircase to the main living room, leaving every single light on along the way to ensure she felt completely secure. I guided her to the large, comfortable leather armchair situated near the fireplace. I spent a few quiet minutes arranging the wooden logs and igniting a warm, crackling fire, hoping the soft, glowing light would bring some life back to her pale, bruised face. I went into the kitchen and brewed 2 cups of chamomile tea, stirring in a generous spoonful of honey, exactly the way her late mother used to make it. When I handed her the warm mug, her hands were still shaking visibly, rattling the delicate porcelain against the saucer. She took a slow, careful sip, the heat seemingly melting away, a small fraction of her icy terror. I sat down on the sofa opposite her, resting my elbows on my knees and clasping my hands together. I needed to understand the full scope of the nightmare unfolding inside my son's house. "Lily," I began carefully, keeping my tone as gentle and steady as humanly possible. "You told me earlier that your father is always sleeping now. You said he never wakes up when you need him. I need you to tell me exactly what has been happening to him." Lily stared into the dancing orange flames of the fireplace, tightly gripping the warm mug in her hands. "It started a few months ago," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackling wood. "At first, Dad said he was exhausted from taking extra shifts at the hospital. But then he stopped going to work altogether. He took an indefinite medical leave, but Stephanie told me not to tell you because it would worry you. She said he needed a long, uninterrupted rest. But he is not just resting, Grandpa. He is disappearing." I leaned forward, my heart sinking heavily with every word. "Tell me what you mean by disappearing," I prompted. "He sleeps for 14 hours a day," she explained, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "And when he is awake, he is not really there. He stumbles when he walks down the hallway. He drops his coffee mug because his hands shake so badly. Last week I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall. I asked him a simple question, and he could not even remember what day of the week it was. His words are always slurred, like he is trapped underwater. It is terrifying to watch him fade away like that. I tried to talk to him to ask if he needed to see another doctor. But every single time I tried to warn him or tell him I was scared, Stephanie would find out." My blood ran completely cold as the horrifying puzzle pieces began to snap into place. "And what did Stephanie do when you tried to warn him?" I asked, my voice barely concealing the dark fury building rapidly in my chest. Lily swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white around her mug. She would wait until Dad was completely passed out, she whispered, her voice trembling with deep trauma. Then she would drag me down the hallway and lock me in the dark basement. She told me that if I ever bothered my father again, she would leave me down there for days. She said nobody would believe me anyway, because she was the adult, and I was just a troubled kid. She kept him completely isolated, Grandpa. She controlled his food, his medicine, his phone. He is a prisoner in his own house, and he does not even realize it. I sat back against the leather sofa, the horrifying truth settling over me like a suffocating, heavy blanket. The woman had methodically isolated my son, cutting off his contact with the outside world, while slowly breaking his mind and body. She had terrorized his only child into total silence, using the terrifying darkness of a basement as her primary weapon. Matthew was not suffering from simple depression or medical burnout. He was being systematically incapacitated right under my nose. And I knew, with the certainty of a man who had stared pure evil in the face for 40 years, that whatever was destroying my son was not a natural illness. It was a calculated lethal poison, and I was going to find exactly what it was. I sat by the dying embers of the fireplace long after Lily had finally drifted into a restless, exhausted sleep, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket. The early morning light began to bleed through the frost-covered windows of my living room, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. My mind, trained over decades to dissect complex criminal motives, raced through the terrifying symptoms my granddaughter had just described. Matthew was a brilliant board-certified orthopedic surgeon. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy and chemistry. A man with his medical pedigree does not simply succumb to a mysterious, debilitating lethargy without aggressively seeking multiple expert opinions. He would have run every blood panel, scheduled every scan, and consulted the brightest minds in his field. He would have fought the illness with every medical resource available to him. The only logical reason a doctor of his extraordinary caliber would willingly waste away in a darkened bedroom, entirely detached from reality, was if his cognitive functions were being systematically and intentionally suppressed. He was being kept in a highly controlled state of chemical compliance. In every single criminal case I had ever presided over during my 40 years on the bench, from petty theft to organized crime behavior, this methodical and patient always pointed to one universal motive: money. Stephanie was a former luxury real estate agent, a fiercely ambitious woman who built her entire career on evaluating high-value assets, identifying structural vulnerabilities, and closing incredibly lucrative deals. She had absolutely not married my son for love or companionship. She had married a highly profitable financial portfolio, and now she was actively executing a completely hostile takeover from the inside out. I quietly stood up from the comfortable leather sofa, my aging joints aching slightly from the freezing dampness of the long Chicago night. I walked slowly up the carpeted stairs to the guest bedroom and silently checked on Lily. She was sleeping soundly, clutching a soft pillow tightly to her chest, her breathing finally deep, rhythmic, and even. I backed out of the room and engaged the advanced security system on my house, ensuring that not a single door or window could be breached without triggering a massive immediate police response. I left a reassuring handwritten note on the granite kitchen counter for her, stating I had stepped out for a brief morning meeting and would return long before she woke up. I walked out into the freezing morning air, the biting, icy wind whipping aggressively against my heavy wool coat, and climbed into my car. The massive, sprawling city was just beginning to wake up, the dark streets slick with a fresh layer of gray slush and melting ice. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, navigating the slippery roads as I steered my vehicle toward the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. I did not need to guess where the bulk of the money was kept. When Matthew's first wife tragically passed away, leaving a massive void in our lives, I had personally overseen the careful creation of an ironclad trust fund for my granddaughter. It was a highly substantial estate valued at exactly $10 million, specifically designed to provide for her education, her ultimate security, and her permanent future. As the founding guarantor of that specific trust, I maintained absolute legal authority to audit the accounts at any given time. I needed to see exactly what Stephanie was trying to steal. I pulled directly into the private, heavily guarded underground parking garage of a highly exclusive wealth management firm located on the 42nd floor of a prominent downtown high-rise. During my extensive tenure as a Superior Court judge, I had carefully cultivated deep, enduring relationships with some of the most powerful, influential individuals in the city. One of those trusted individuals was Edward Lancaster, the senior executive vice president of this particular financial institution. Edward was a meticulous, fiercely loyal man who valued absolute discretion and professional integrity above all else. I had called him on his private encrypted line while driving, waking him up long before dawn, and demanding a clandestine meeting before the bank officially opened its heavy glass doors to the public. When the polished mahogany elevator doors slid open silently, Edward was already standing in the dimly lit marble foyer waiting for me. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his face lined with deep concern and quiet apprehension. He knew perfectly well that I would never demand a secret meeting at 6 in the morning unless it was a matter of absolute life and death. He shook my hand firmly, leading me silently down a long, quiet corridor into a highly secure, soundproof conference room. There were no assistants present to greet us. There was no polite coffee service offered. We sat down facing each other at the heavy oak table, the sprawling, glorious skyline of Chicago completely visible through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind his chair. Edward did not offer any empty pleasantries or casual conversation. He simply opened a thick, leather-bound portfolio, produced a highly secure encrypted tablet, and waited patiently for my instructions. "I need you to open this master ledger for Lily's trust fund," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need to see every single transaction, every formal administrative request, and every digital footprint attached to that account over the last 6 consecutive months." Edward typed a series of security codes into his tablet, his eyes scanning the encrypted data as it rapidly populated the screen. I watched his expression carefully, looking for any sign of trouble. As a seasoned financial executive, he was professionally trained to remain entirely stoic, but I saw a faint flicker of hesitation cross his disciplined features. He slowly turned the screen toward me, pushing the heavy tablet across the polished wooden table. "William," he began, his tone incredibly cautious, quiet, and deeply measured. "As the founding guarantor, you have the absolute legal right to view this information. However, you should know right now that there has been a highly unusual, completely unprecedented flurry of administrative activity regarding this specific account over the past 3 weeks." My heart slammed violently against my ribs. "Activity initiated by whom?" I asked, leaning forward and putting my reading glasses on to examine the complex spreadsheets. Edward tapped a specific highlighted line of data on the glowing screen. "The requests were officially submitted under the legal digital signature of your son Matthew," he explained quietly. "But the corresponding communication, the endless emails, the recorded phone calls, and the aggressive demanding follow-ups with our legal department were all exclusively handled by his wife, Stephanie. She has been systematically laying the legal groundwork to bypass the strict withdrawal restrictions." I stared intently at the digital ledger, my eyes locking onto a specific, incredibly alarming administrative request filed just 2 short days ago. It was a formal legal petition designed to restructure the protective parameters of my granddaughter's inheritance. Stephanie was not just testing the waters. She was preparing to drain the massive vault entirely to steal everything that rightfully belonged to my innocent granddaughter. I stared intently at the digital ledger, my eyes locking onto a specific, incredibly alarming administrative request filed just 2 short days ago. The document glowing on the screen before me was a formal legal petition designed to completely restructure the protective parameters of my granddaughter's inheritance. I reached out and tapped the screen, expanding the heavily encrypted file to read the fine print. Edward sat silently across from me, his hands folded neatly on the polished oak table, allowing me to process the absolute magnitude of the betrayal hidden within those digital pages. The petition was a formal request to transfer the sole uncontested trusteeship of the $10 million estate directly to my son. Under normal circumstances, the trust was ironclad, deliberately designed to remain inaccessible until Lily reached the age of 25, ensuring her education and future were completely insulated from any external financial pressures. However, legal documents of this nature always contain specific emergency clauses. My late daughter-in-law had insisted on including a medical emergency provision. If Lily ever suffered a catastrophic health crisis or required permanent institutional care, the primary guardian could petition to dissolve the age restrictions to cover the overwhelming medical expenses. Stephanie had somehow discovered that exact hidden loophole buried deep within the complex clauses. She had scoured the incredibly dense legal language of the trust and extracted the single weapon she needed to bypass my authority as the founding guarantor. The justification, explicitly typed into the digital form, made my blood run cold. It cited Lily as suffering from severe, untreatable violent psychosis and requested emergency access to the funds to cover an impending permanent psychiatric institutionalization. She had carefully orchestrated the entire horrific nightmare at the house, ruthlessly pushed my vulnerable granddaughter to the absolute breaking point, and successfully manipulated a local precinct detective, all to rapidly create a permanent documented paper trail of violent mental instability. The police report from last night was not just a cruel punishment for a dropped glass. It was the final necessary piece of legal evidence required to trigger the medical emergency clause of a $10 million fortune. I slowly zoomed in on the bottom edge of the glowing digital document, carefully focusing my undivided attention on the critical authorization line. A restructuring petition of this sheer magnitude required the physical signature of the primary guardian. I stared quietly at the high-resolution digital scan of my beloved sons, handwriting my heavy heart, completely breaking all over again in the silent room. Matthew had always possessed the precise, elegant, and perfectly controlled penmanship of a master surgeon. His signature was typically a sharp, confident stroke of black ink. The signature scrawled across the bottom of this petition was a horrific, tragic distortion of his name. It was incredibly shaky, deeply uneven, and painfully weak. The pen had clearly lingered too long on certain curves, causing the ink to pool and bleed into the paper. The letters were disconnected, dragging downward, in a clear manifestation of profound neurological distress. It was the signature of a man who could barely hold a pen, let alone comprehend the dense, life-altering legal document placed in front of him. He had been heavily sedated, likely guided by a firm hand pressing down on his own. Stephanie had propped him up just long enough to extract his signature before letting him sink back into the toxic chemical fog she was feeding him. I slowly took off my reading glasses and placed them on the table, rubbing the bridge of my nose as the complete, terrifying scope of her grand master plan fully materialized in my mind. It was a brilliantly evil, flawlessly calculated two-step maneuver. Step 1 was entirely focused on Lily. By successfully having my granddaughter legally declared insane and involuntarily committed to a long-term psychiatric ward, Stephanie would permanently remove the sole beneficiary of the estate from the equation. Lily would be locked away, heavily medicated, and completely silenced. She would lose all legal standing, transferring total administrative control of the $10 million directly to her father. Step 2 was focused entirely on Matthew. I thought back to his gray, sunken face in the interrogation room, the way his shoulders slumped, the terrifyingly vacant look in his eyes. Stephanie was actively poisoning him. She was feeding him something that systematically destroyed his cognitive abilities while mimicking the rapid onset of severe neurological decline. Once the $10 million was successfully transferred into a joint account under his control, Matthew would suddenly and tragically suffer a catastrophic medical emergency, perhaps a massive stroke or total organ failure. With Matthew legally incapacitated or tragically deceased, control of his entire financial portfolio would automatically default to his next of kin. It would default to his legal spouse, the woman holding his general power of attorney. Stephanie. She was not just attempting to steal from my granddaughter. She was methodically removing every single human obstacle standing between her and $25 million in combined assets. She planned to lock an innocent 15-year-old girl in a mental asylum for the rest of her life, and she planned to murder my son to inherit his wealth. She was sitting in my son's house right now, playing the role of the devoted tragic wife, knowing she was exactly one signature and a few short days away from executing the perfect, untraceable crime. The sheer scale of her psychopathy was almost difficult to comprehend. She had weaponized the medical system, the legal system, and the police department simultaneously. She was banking entirely on the assumption that a grieving family would simply accept the tragic deterioration of a hard-working surgeon and the sad mental decline of a traumatized teenager. She had calculated every single variable, manipulated every emotion, and covered almost every track. But she had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. She had drastically underestimated the fierce, unrelenting instincts of a veteran judge. She had foolishly assumed I was just a tired old man who would blindly accept her sweet, tearful lies and quietly step aside. I looked across the table at Edward. His face was pale, his hands resting perfectly still. He did not need to ask what I was thinking. The grim reality of the situation was hanging heavily in the silent, soundproof air between us. William, Edward said softly, breaking the heavy silence. The petition was filed late Friday afternoon because of the sheer size of the trust and the complexity of the medical emergency clause. Our legal compliance team placed a mandatory 72-hour hold on the transfer. That hold expires on Monday morning at exactly 9. If we do not intervene with a formal legal injunction before then, the funds will automatically clear into an external account controlled entirely by your son and his wife. I checked my watch. It was currently 6:30 on Saturday morning. I had exactly 48 hours to completely dismantle a meticulously planned murder and financial heist. I had exactly 48 hours to save my only beloved son from a slow, agonizing death and protect my granddaughter from a lifetime of institutionalized torture. I left the towering glass and steel high-rise with a heavy heart and a mind moving at lightning speed. The brutal winter wind ripped through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, biting at my face as I walked quickly to my car. I slipped behind the leather steering wheel and immediately turned on the heater, letting the engine idle while I pulled out my secure mobile phone. I dialed a number I had not used in over 3 years. The man on the other end of the line was Benjamin Carter. Bun was a highly decorated retired federal agent who spent his entire career dismantling organized crime syndicates. He was also a man who owed me his life. Decades ago, Ben was framed by a corrupt superior officer and nearly sent to a maximum security federal prison. As the presiding judge on his highly publicized case, I saw straight and completely exonerated him. Since that fateful day, Ben had been my most fiercely loyal ally, operating as an elite private investigator, lurking quietly in the shadows of the city. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and raspy. I told him I needed to see him immediately at our usual discreet spot. He did not ask a single question. He simply said he would be there in 20 minutes. I drove carefully through the worsening snowstorm toward a small, dimly lit diner. The diner was a quiet relic of a bygone era, featuring faded red vinyl booths, flickering neon signs, and a lingering, comforting smell of burnt coffee and fried food. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting because it was devoid of anyone who might recognize a former judge. I parked in the empty snow-covered lot and walked inside, shivering slightly as I shook the heavy white flakes from my dark wool coat. Bun was already sitting in a secluded corner booth facing the entrance, nursing a steaming mug of black coffee. He was a large, imposing man in his early 50s, with sharp, observant eyes and a tough, rugged demeanor that commanded absolute, immediate respect. I slid quietly into the creaking vinyl booth across from him. I did not waste any time with polite pleasantries. I laid out the entire horrifying situation from beginning to end, detailing the shocking scene at the police station. The traumatized girl locked in a claustrophobic basement, the rapid toxic deterioration of my only son, and the imminent total theft of a massive $10 million trust fund. Ben listened to me in total stoic silence, his strong jaw clenching tighter with every sickening detail I revealed about Stephanie and her ruthless manipulations. When I finally finished speaking, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his dark coffee and placed the thick ceramic mug firmly on the scratched wooden table. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that Stephanie was operating with the cold, calculating precision of a professional predator, but she had made a massive, fatal error by crossing into his territory and messing with my family. I asked him what we needed to do to completely destroy her operation. Ben leaned forward and meticulously outlined a highly aggressive, deeply covert infiltration plan. We needed irrefutable, concrete physical proof of her ongoing criminal actions before Monday morning arrived. We needed to gain full, unrestricted access to the massive Lincoln Park mansion to plant hidden surveillance equipment and gather any physical forensic evidence she might be hiding behind closed doors. Ben explained that his elite private security team could easily bypass their advanced residential alarm system and deploy ultra-high-definition microcameras in every single critical room of the house. We would securely wire the sprawling living room, the luxurious master bedroom where my son was trapped, her private home office, where she kept her files, and that dreaded dark concrete basement where she tortured my granddaughter. We also urgently needed to search her private bathroom for whatever toxic, lethal substance she was secretly feeding my vulnerable son. The only difficult catch was that his specialized tactical team required at least 2 full hours inside the massive property without any risk of sudden interruption. I told him that buying precious time was exactly what I did best in a courtroom. I quickly formulated a solid plan to lure my son and his wicked wife entirely away from the house for an extended period of time. I would invite them to an exclusive hours-long lunch at my private country club. The club was located deep in the northern suburbs, ensuring a long, arduous drive through the heavy snow. More importantly, it had a strict no-cell-phone policy within the main dining room, which meant Stephanie would be cut off from any security alerts her smart home system might try to send to her device while we were eating. Ben nodded his strong approval, his dark eyes gleaming with intense professional anticipation. He told me to make the phone call right now and set the bait before she could make another move. I took a deep breath to calm my racing heart and dialed the phone number of my son. Stephanie answered on the third ring, her voice dripping with that same fake, sugary exhaustion she had weaponized at the police precinct just a few hours prior. I swallowed my immense pride and delivered the greatest dramatic performance of my entire life. I forced my voice to sound incredibly weary, broken, and deeply apologetic. I told her that I had spent the entire morning reflecting on the terrible events of the previous night, and I realized that I had severely overstepped my bounds as a grandfather. I told her that dealing with Lily this morning had shown me just how deeply disturbed and troubled my granddaughter truly was. I admitted that I was entirely wrong to fight them, and I agreed that a long-term psychiatric facility was probably the only viable medical solution left for our struggling family. The trap was set perfectly. I could practically hear the arrogant, victorious smile spreading widely across her face through the phone receiver. She graciously accepted my fake apology, adopting the sickening role of the merciful, forgiving stepmother who only wanted peace. I then invited her and Matthew to join me for an extensive, highly exclusive lunch at my country club that afternoon. I framed it as a necessary peace offering, a crucial time for us to heal and finalize the difficult institutionalization paperwork together as a united family front. I insisted that we desperately needed a quiet, elegant space to discuss such a delicate and heartbreaking matter without any distractions. Her overwhelming greed and her intense desire to maintain absolute dominance made her accept the lunch invitation instantly. She promised they would leave the house by noon and drive straight to the club together. I thanked her and hung up the phone, feeling deep disgust wash over me. I looked across the table at Ben. The vicious predator had officially taken the bait. We now had a precise window of opportunity to strike back and officially save my innocent family. The heavy oak doors of the exclusive Oak Brook Heritage Country Club swung open to greet us immediately, enveloping us in the rich, comforting scent of aged leather and roasted cedar. I had arrived 20 minutes early to secure our private table located right beside the massive stone fireplace. When Matthew and Stephanie finally walked through the grand entrance, my heart sank deep into my stomach. My son was bundled in a thick cashmere coat, yet he was visibly shivering. He moved with the slow, shuffling gait of a man decades older than his 42 years. Stephanie, on the other hand, looked absolutely radiant. She wore a tailored crimson dress, her arm linked tightly through his, projecting the flawless image of a devoted, supportive spouse. I stood up to greet them, forcing a warm, apologetic smile onto my face, while my blood boiled with pure, unrelenting hatred. As they approached the maitre d' station, the strict club protocol was immediately enforced. The head steward, a man I had tipped generously for the past 20 years, politely extended a velvet-lined silver tray. He informed them that cellular devices were strictly prohibited in the main dining hall to preserve the tranquil atmosphere. I watched Stephanie closely. A fleeting shadow of genuine panic crossed her perfectly manicured face. Her hand instinctively tightened around her designer purse. She needed that phone to monitor her smart home security alerts. But turning back now, after I had offered such a massive, lucrative olive branch, would arouse far too much suspicion. She forced a stiff, practiced laugh, placed her phone onto the silver tray, and guided my son toward our table. She had taken the bait entirely. With her communication to the outside world completely severed, the real operation could officially begin. Miles away in the freezing snow-covered streets of Lincoln Park, my trusted investigator, Ben Carter, was making his move. I knew the exact layout of his tactical plan. As the waiter poured our sparkling water at the country club, Ben and his 2 elite security specialists were silently approaching the rear service entrance of my son's massive estate. Ben carried a specialized military-grade decryption device. He connected it directly to the exterior digital keypad, running a complex algorithmic bypass that flawlessly disabled the perimeter alarms and deactivated the motion sensors without triggering a single notification to the security company. The heavy reinforced door clicked open with a soft, barely audible thud. They stepped inside the dark, empty house, moving with the quiet, lethal precision of ghosts. Back at the table, the lunch was proving to be a horrific psychological torture session. Matthew could barely hold his heavy crystal water glass. I watched in absolute agony as his hands trembled violently, the cold water sloshing over the pristine white tablecloth. Stephanie immediately leaned over, her voice dripping with sickly sweet condescension as she gently pried the glass from his shaking fingers. "Let me help you with that, darling," she cooed delicately, wiping the spilled water with her cloth napkin. She turned to me with a tragic, long, suffering sigh, shaking her head sadly, as if to say, "Look at the tremendous burden I carry." When the waiter arrived to take our orders, she did not even allow my son to speak. She swiftly ordered a light vegetable broth for him, claiming his fragile stomach could not handle anything richer. He simply stared blankly at the roaring fireplace, his eyes glazed and vacant, completely surrendering his bodily autonomy to the woman slowly poisoning him to death. I swallowed my intense disgust, playing my designated role to perfection. I lowered my head, staring contritely at my porcelain plate, and offered a long, deeply emotional apology for my aggressive behavior at the police station. I told her I was just a frightened, foolish old man who did not understand the severe complexity of teenage mental illness. She soaked up my submission like a parched sponge, completely unaware that a team of professionals was currently dismantling her empire of lies. While she sat there gloating over her expensive salad, Ben was systematically securing the first floor of her mansion. He moved swiftly into the sprawling, impeccably decorated living room. Using a modified drill that made absolutely no sound, his team embedded a microscopic high-definition camera directly inside the ornate crown molding right above the television set. It provided a sweeping, unobstructed view of the entire room. From there, they moved quickly into Stephanie's private home office. This was her primary command center. Bun expertly placed a second stealth camera behind the ventilation grate directly facing her large mahogany desk, ensuring that every document she read and every pill she crushed would be perfectly captured in crystal-clear digital resolution. They worked in complete disciplined silence, communicating only through subtle hand gestures as the precious minutes ticked by. I kept the conversation at the club moving at a slow, agonizingly deliberate pace, ordering a second course and asking extensive detailed questions about the psychiatric facility they had supposedly researched for Lily. Stephanie eagerly described the bleak, restrictive institution as a wonderful, healing sanctuary. Every word out of her mouth was a carefully calculated lie designed to secure her absolute control over my granddaughter's massive $10 million trust fund. I nodded sympathetically, offering to pay for the initial deposit out of my own pocket, feeding her insatiable greed to keep her firmly anchored to her padded dining chair. I knew Ben only needed a little more time to secure the two most critical rooms in the house. According to the timeline we had established, Ben was now moving silently up the carpeted stairs to the master bedroom. This was the dark epicenter of my son's rapid deterioration. They planted a third micro camera directly inside the plastic casing of the digital smoke detector mounted on the ceiling right above the king-sized bed. This specific aerial angle would capture exactly how Stephanie was administering the toxic chemical cocktail that was turning a brilliant orthopedic surgeon into a compliant, shuffling zombie. Once the bedroom was fully wired and secured, Ben made his way down to the final, most terrifying location in the home. The basement. The air down there was damp, freezing, and suffocatingly tight. This was the windowless, soundproof concrete vault where she had mercilessly tortured a claustrophobic 15-year-old girl. Ben carefully installed the final camera inside the housing of an exposed overhead light fixture, giving us a permanent, unblinking eye in the darkest, most evil corner of the entire property. The operation was a complete, undetected success. At the country club, the waiter finally cleared our dessert plates, signaling the end of the grueling 2-hour performance. Stephanie wiped her mouth elegantly, thanking me profusely for my profound understanding and my generous financial support. We walked back to the grand lobby where the maitre d' respectfully returned her mobile phone. I watched her quickly tap the glowing screen, her shoulders relaxing visibly when she saw 0 security alerts from her smart home application. She smiled warmly at me, completely convinced that she had successfully manipulated a naive, wealthy old judge into handing over his family without a fight. She linked her arm through my son's weakened, trembling arm and guided him slowly out into the freezing Chicago snow. I stood alone in the quiet lobby, my heart heavy with grief for my son, but burning with a fierce, unstoppable determination. My cell phone vibrated briefly in my coat pocket. It was a single encrypted text message from Ben. The house is fully wired, and the feed is live. We have eyes everywhere. The trap was now perfectly set. The trap was perfectly set. I maintained my facade of an apologetic grandfather as I drove my son and his treacherous wife back to their estate. Matthew slept through the journey, his head resting against the glass. Stephanie sat in the back, checking her home security application to ensure nothing was disturbed during lunch. I felt a grim satisfaction, knowing Ben and his elite team had flawlessly bypassed her digital fortress and vanished. I pulled into their circular driveway, helped my stumbling son out, and bid them farewell. The moment their front door clicked shut, the performance ended. My demeanor shifted to cold, calculated urgency. I drove straight to a deserted industrial park where Ben was waiting inside an unmarked black van. I parked in the shadows and climbed into the passenger seat. Ben did not waste time with pleasant. He reached into a secure metallic lockbox and handed me a transparent evidence bag sealed with heavy tamper-evident tape. Inside were 3 empty glass vials, discarded syringes, and crushed blister packs of medication. Bun explained his team successfully located a hidden compartment behind the custom vanity mirror in Stephanie's master bathroom. She had been discarding her medical waste inside a concealed biohazard container, believing it was safe. I held the bag up to the dim light, my stomach churning at the sight of the dark residue clinging to the glass vials. I thanked Ben for his flawless execution and told him to keep a watchful eye on the live camera feeds. I had to get this physical evidence to a secure laboratory immediately. I drove directly to the medical research campus of Chicago Memorial Hospital. I bypassed the crowded public entrances and navigated toward the restricted subterranean labs. During my decades presiding over complex criminal trials, I relied extensively on the brilliant analytical mind of Dr. Victor Bradley. Victor was a highly decorated toxicologist who frequently served as my trusted expert witness in high-profile cases. I had called him from the road, invoking a severe personal emergency and demanding absolute discretion. When I walked through the heavy reinforced doors of his private lab, Victor was already waiting for me. I handed him the sealed evidence bag and briefly explained the rapid, horrifying physical deterioration of my son. Victor did not ask any unnecessary questions. He understood the grave urgency instantly. He took the plastic bag over to a stainless steel table and carefully extracted the discarded vials using sterilized tweezers. I stood quietly in the corner of the sterile room, crossing my arms tightly over my chest to suppress my trembling. The agonizing wait felt like an eternity. The only sounds in the laboratory were the low humming of ventilation systems and the rhythmic clicking of complex analytical machinery. I watched Victor extract minute chemical samples from the glass vials, transferring them into small test tubes before placing them inside a humming centrifuge. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. I paced across the white-tiled floor, replaying the horrifying image of my son slumped lifelessly in that interrogation chair. After nearly 2 grueling hours of agonizing silence, the primary analytical machine finally emitted a sharp, digital chime. Victor walked over to the computer monitor, his eyes scanning the dense cascade of chemical data populating the bright screen. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. He removed his protective glasses, letting out a long, trembling exhale before turning to face me. The profound sorrow in his eyes told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "William," he began, his voice barely a whisper echoing in the sterile room. "I have analyzed the chemical residue inside these vials, and I need you to prepare yourself for what I am about to tell you." He pointed a shaking finger at the digital chart on the monitor. The primary substance inside these discarded vials is a highly concentrated synthetic formulation of a potent sedative called lorazepam. It is a powerful, fast-acting benzodiazepine designed to completely suppress the central nervous system. It explains your son's severe lethargy and heavily slurred speech. But the sedative is only the delivery mechanism for something far more sinister. I took a slow, shaky step toward the stainless steel table, bracing my hands against the cold metal edge. "Tell me what else is in those vials, Victor," I demanded, my voice dropping to a dark, resonant octave. He took a deep breath and looked me dead in the eye. "The secondary substance is a highly lethal heavy metal known as thallium," he explained grimly. "Thallium is completely tasteless, colorless, and odorless. It is an incredibly toxic substance that is strictly regulated and nearly impossible for an ordinary citizen to acquire. When ingested consistently over a prolonged period of time, it attacks the neurological pathways and the cardiovascular system. It destroys the myelin sheath around the nerves, causing severe tremors, acute muscle weakness, and profound cognitive decline. My vision blurred as the horrifying reality of his clinical explanation crashed down on me. "She is poisoning him," I whispered, my voice thick with absolute disbelief. "She is doing much more than simply poisoning him," William Victor corrected me softly. "She is actively executing a slow, perfectly calculated medical assassination." Thallium poisoning is incredibly difficult to detect in a standard hospital blood panel, unless the attending physician specifically knows what to look for. By combining the heavy metal with massive daily doses of powerful sedatives, she is flawlessly masking the acute toxic symptoms. She is meticulously manufacturing the clinical appearance of early-onset dementia, coupled with rapid degenerative heart failure. If she continues administering this exact dosage, your son's cardiovascular system will completely collapse within weeks. He will suffer a massive catastrophic heart attack in his sleep. And because of his carefully documented decline, the medical examiner will likely rule it as a tragic natural death. The sterile white walls of the subterranean laboratory seemed to spin violently around me. I gripped the edge of the steel table until my knuckles turned completely white, forcing myself to remain standing. Stephanie was not merely a greedy opportunist, looking to steal a $10 million trust fund from a teenager. She was a deeply psychopathic, cold-blooded murderer, actively committing a flawless, untraceable homicide under my nose. She had carefully researched the perfect lethal chemical combination, procured highly restricted toxic substances, and administered them daily to a man who loved and trusted her completely. She watched my son slowly waste away, watched him lose his brilliant mind and physical strength, and she felt absolutely nothing but the thrilling anticipation of a massive impending payday. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the freezing air to steady my racing heart. The profound grief threatening to consume me hardened into a solid, unbreakable wall of pure, calculated fury. I thanked Victor for his brilliant forensic work and instructed him to secure the physical evidence inside a locked vault. I walked out of the hospital and into the freezing winter night, my mind focused with lethal clarity. The time for observation was over. It was time to destroy her. 3 agonizing days had passed since I left that subterranean hospital laboratory, with the horrifying truth burning in my mind. 3 days of forcing myself to play the compliant grandfather while a lethal timer ticked down on my son's life. I had completely retreated into the heavy oak walls of my private study, locking the wooden door behind me. I had successfully transformed my peaceful sanctuary into a dark, secure surveillance command center. 4 extremely large, high-resolution monitors dominated my mahogany desk, casting a harsh, pale, bluish glow across the room. Each glowing screen displayed a continuous, crystal-clear live video feed directly from the hidden micro-cameras Ben and his tactical team had successfully planted inside the Lincoln Park mansion. I sat rigidly in my leather chair, surrounded by the darkness of my study, watching the quiet, terrifying domestic horror film unfold in real time. My sharp legal mind knew that knowing the truth and proving the truth in court were 2 entirely different battles. I possessed the forensic toxicology report, but any smart defense attorney could easily argue that Matthew was self-medicating or that an employee had tampered with his food. I needed irrefutable high-definition visual evidence of Stephanie actively administering the lethal chemical cocktail to my son. I absolutely needed to watch her commit the horrific crime. The emotional toll of sitting in that dark room and watching my son slowly deteriorate was just absolutely staggering. It was a unique, agonizing form of psychological torture that threatened to break my spirit entirely. I watched the live feeds with the unblinking focus of a seasoned predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I saw Lily walking cautiously through the living room, keeping her head down, completely terrified of making any noise that might trigger the wrath of her wicked stepmother. She moved like a fragile ghost. I saw Matthew shuffling aimlessly through the hallways, his shoulders slumped, his eyes completely vacant, looking like a hollow phantom haunting his own home. And then there was Stephanie. She moved through the luxurious house with the arrogant grace of a queen surveying her conquered territory. She spent hours in her private office organizing financial documents, highlighting clauses in real estate portfolios, and drafting preliminary emails to high-end asset liquidators. She was actively preparing to sell off my son's entire estate the moment his heart finally gave out, showing absolutely zero human empathy. It happened on the morning of the third day. The digital clock on my primary monitor read exactly 7:15. The camera mounted discreetly above the master bedroom captured Stephanie emerging from her private bathroom. She was dressed in a pristine white silk robe looking vibrant and well-rested. Matthew was already awake, sitting heavily on the edge of the large king-sized bed. He was hunched over his elbows, resting on his knees, his face buried deeply in his trembling hands. He looked utterly defeated, unable to summon the physical strength to even stand up. Stephanie walked casually over to a small coffee station set up in the corner of the bedroom suite. She poured a steaming cup of black coffee from the silver carafe. Then she turned her back slightly toward the doorway, blocking the view from anyone who might be standing in the hall. But she could not block the aerial view of the micro camera hidden inside the ceiling smoke detector. I leaned forward in my leather chair, my hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so hard, my joints ached. I watched with paralyzing horror as she reached deep into the pocket of her silk robe. She pulled out a small, unmarked glass vial and a plastic medical dropper. Her movements were incredibly practiced, smooth, and casual. She did not hesitate. She did not show a single ounce of remorse or guilt. With clinical, cold-blooded precision, she extracted a measured dose of the clear, tasteless liquid, the lethal mixture of severe sedatives and toxic thallium. She held the dropper steadily over the steaming coffee cup and squeezed the bulb, releasing the deadly poison directly into the dark liquid. She then calmly placed the vial back into her pocket, picked up a small silver spoon, and stirred the coffee with a gentle, rhythmic motion. She picked up the poisoned cup and walked slowly over to my ailing son. She offered him an artificially warm smile that made my stomach churn with violent disgust. "Here you go, darling." I could hear her softly coo through the hidden audio feed. "Drink this warm liquid. It will help clear your foggy head." Matthew looked up at her with heavy, trusting eyes. He blindly accepted the cup from her hands, his fingers trembling so severely that the hot, dark liquid nearly sloshed over the ceramic brim. He brought the cup to his dry lips and took a long, slow drink, completely unaware that the woman he loved was actively pouring literal death down his throat. I watched the digital feed, my breathing shallow and tight, as the powerful high-dose sedative began to rapidly assault his compromised central nervous system. It took less than 10 minutes for the heavy chemical cocktail to completely override his body. Matthew tried to stand up, perhaps to walk to the bathroom, but his legs simply buckled beneath him. He swayed dangerously, grasping blindly at the empty air before collapsing heavily into a nearby upholstered reading chair. His head lolled backward against the fabric, his jaw dropping slack, his eyes fluttering shut as he slipped into a deep, unnatural, drug-induced coma. What Stephanie did next shattered whatever remaining fraction of human restraint I possessed. She did not rush to his side. She did not check his pulse or call out his name in a panic. She simply stood there in the center of the luxurious room, looking down at the incapacitated, broken man she had vowed to love and protect. She stared at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated boredom. It was the look of someone waiting impatiently for a tedious chore to finally be over. She casually stepped over his drooping leg, completely ignoring his labored, rattling breaths, and walked directly to a full-length mirror mounted on the closet door. I watched in absolute horror as she spent the next 5 minutes critically examining her own reflection, adjusting the lapels of her silk robe, and playfully practicing different somber morning facial expressions. She was literally rehearsing for his impending funeral while he lay dying just a few feet away. A profound, crushing sorrow washed over me, threatening to drown me in grief for the brilliant boy I had raised. But that sorrow was instantaneously incinerated by a terrifying volcanic fury. The dark shadows of my study seemed to press in around me, matching the darkness taking over my soul. Looking at the psychopathic monster, admiring her reflection, I knew there would be absolutely no mercy. I reached for my secure phone and dialed Benjamin Carter. The time for silent observation was officially over. I told Ben to prepare the final phase of our operation. It was time to spring the ultimate trap. I lowered the mobile phone from my ear and placed it on the mahogany desk. The silence of my study pressed against my eardrums, a stark contrast to the violent storm raging inside my chest. I had given Benjamin Carter the green light to initiate the final tactical phase of our operation, but the wait was far from over. I leaned back into the leather of my chair and rubbed the exhaustion from my eyes. The 4 massive monitors continued to cast their pale, bluish glow across the dark room. My gaze drifted from the living room feed, which remained empty, to the primary camera mounted inside the master bedroom ceiling. The digital timestamp in the corner of the screen pulsed with a steady blink. It was early afternoon, and the sprawling luxury estate was disturbingly quiet. My eyes locked onto the tragic, broken figure of my only son. Matthew had not moved an inch since Stephanie poisoned his coffee several hours ago. He was slumped heavily in the reading chair in the corner of the bedroom suite. His chin rested against his chest, his arms dangling over the armrests like a discarded marionette. His breathing was incredibly shallow, a fragile intake of air that barely managed to lift his shoulders. Watching my brilliant son reduced to this comatose state felt like a knife twisting slowly in my gut. He was vulnerable, stripped of his sharp intellect, his physical strength, and his fundamental dignity. I pressed my hands flat against my desk, anchoring myself to reality, as the overwhelming urge to drive over there and drag him out of that house threatened my logical judgment. I had to remain completely patient. I needed the final piece of the criminal puzzle to seal her fate forever. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my attention on the monitor displaying the grand entryway. The heavy front door swung open. Stephanie stepped into the foyer wearing a sleek black dress that perfectly accentuated her calculated grace. She had applied a dark shade of crimson lipstick, and her entire demeanor exuded a thrilling anticipation. She did not open the door to greet a delivery driver or a casual neighbor. She stepped aside, a predatory smile stretching across her face as a tall man walked confidently into the foyer. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, brushing a few stray flakes of snow from his lapels. The camera angle was positioned directly behind him, completely obscuring his facial features. I leaned close to the glowing screen, my heart hammering an unsteady rhythm against my ribs. Who was this man? Stephanie reached out and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him into a brief embrace before taking his coat and hanging it in the front closet. They did not linger in the foyer. Stephanie took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, and began leading him up the grand sweeping staircase toward the second floor. I watched them pass through the hallway camera feed, their bodies pressing close together, whispering in hushed tones. My stomach churned with a sickening blend of profound disgust and mounting anxiety. They walked directly toward the master bedroom suite. When the heavy door swung open on the primary bedroom monitor, my son remained completely unresponsive in his chair. He did not flinch. He did not stir. He was entirely lost to the world, a silent witness to his own impending destruction. Stephanie walked boldly into the center of the room, still holding the stranger's hand. She gestured casually toward my comatose son, with her free hand tossing her head back in a silent laugh. The man stepped further into the room, stopping mere feet away from the heavily sedated body of my child. What followed was a display of such profound, terrifying, grotesque psychological cruelty that it temporarily suspended my ability to breathe. Stephanie stepped directly into the man's personal space. She reached her hands up, tangling her fingers deeply into his styled dark hair. He wrapped his arms securely around her slender waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Right there, standing over the broken body of her husband, they engaged in a deeply passionate, hungry, and violently intimate kiss. It was an absolutely appalling desecration of the marital bedroom, a vile celebration of their shared, lethal secret. They kissed with the greedy intensity of two predators who had cornered their prey and were excitedly anticipating the incoming slaughter. They pulled apart slowly, their foreheads resting against one another, as they shared a sinister, knowing smile. Stephanie gently traced his jawbone with her manicured thumb, her eyes completely devoid of the fake sorrow she had weaponized so flawlessly at the police precinct just a few nights ago. The man finally took a step back, breaking the intimate embrace to casually adjust the cuffs of his expensive, tailored suit. As he moved toward the center of the room, he turned his body fully toward the large custom vanity mirror, exposing his face directly to the microcamera hidden directly above the bed. My hand shot out automatically, grasping the computer mouse with frantic, trembling urgency. I quickly dragged the digital cursor over his face and clicked the specialized software function to dramatically zoom in on the high-definition feed. The pixels blurred for a fraction of a second before the advanced rendering program sharpened the image into absolute horrifying clarity. I stared at the frozen, highly detailed frame on my primary monitor, and the blood in my veins ran completely, terrifyingly cold. The floor seemingly dropped out from beneath my leather chair. I forgot how to breathe. I forgot how to think. The man standing triumphantly in the bedroom was Dr. Harrison Reed. He was a highly prominent, incredibly respected psychiatric specialist affiliated with one of the most prestigious medical boards in the entire state of Illinois. But far more importantly, he was Matthew's deeply trusted medical colleague and our family's long-standing personal friend. Harrison had attended my late wife's funeral. He had stood in my living room drinking my scotch, offering me his deepest, most profound condolences. And just 48 hours ago, Harrison Reed was the exact licensed medical professional who had officially signed the expedited psychiatric evaluation, declaring my innocent 15-year-old granddaughter to be violently unhinged and a severe danger to society. The staggering labyrinthine depth of this criminal conspiracy crashed down upon my shoulders with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. This was not merely a case of an opportunistic wife secretly poisoning her husband. This was a highly sophisticated, very meticulously coordinated medical assassination and a massive financial heist executed by two brilliant, cold-blooded psychopaths. Harrison had provided the highly restricted synthetic sedatives and the untraceable lethal heavy metal. He had utilized his unquestionable medical authority to rapidly validate Lily's fake diagnosis, completely clearing the path for Stephanie to legally seize the massive $10 million trust fund without raising a single red flag. Together, they had weaponized the entire healthcare system to slowly murder my son and permanently lock away my granddaughter in a psychiatric ward. My profound sorrow instantly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, absolute, and utterly lethal judicial wrath. The shock of seeing Dr. Harrison Reed standing in my son's master bedroom paralyzed my entire body. I sat completely frozen in my dark study, my eyes locked on the high-definition monitor. This was the man who had stood in my living room offering his deepest sympathies when my wife passed away. This was the highly respected medical professional who had sworn an oath to preserve human life. Now he was standing over the heavily sedated body of his own colleague, casually adjusting his expensive tailored suit after intimately kissing my son's treacherous wife. The sheer audacity of his presence in that room was a vile, unforgivable betrayal. I reached out with a trembling hand and turned up the volume dial on the primary audio receiver. A soft hiss of static filled my quiet study, followed instantly by the crisp, crystal-clear sound of their horrifying conversation. Stephanie walked toward the large bay window, pulling the heavy velvet curtains tightly shut to block out the freezing Chicago snowstorm. She turned back to face Harrison, a wicked, triumphant smile stretching across her painted lips. You took a massive risk coming here today, Harrison, she murmured, her voice dripping with dark amusement. What if he suddenly woke up? Harrison let out a low, arrogant laugh that made my stomach violently churn in sheer disgust. He walked slowly over to the reading chair, where Matthew was slumped completely unconscious and entirely helpless. Harrison casually grabbed my son's limp wrist, checking his sluggish pulse with the detached clinical efficiency of a butcher evaluating a piece of meat. "He is not waking up anytime soon," Stephanie Harrison replied, dropping Matthew's arm callously back onto the armrest. "The dosage you administered this morning was absolutely perfect. The heavy metal cocktail is performing exactly as I calculated. The thallium is systematically destroying his neurological pathways, while the high-dose lorazepam completely masks the acute toxic trauma. I must admit, I am genuinely impressed by my own brilliance. Any standard medical examiner who looks at his recent carefully documented decline will conclude he is suffering from rapid early-onset dementia, coupled with severe cardiovascular failure. It is completely untraceable. There will be absolutely no forensic red flags. We are executing a flawless medical assassination." Stephanie walked over and wrapped her arms securely around his waist, resting her head against his broad chest. I watched them intimately embrace the sickening reality of their twisted pillow talk, echoing loudly through the modern speakers of my dark study. They were casually discussing the premeditated, cold-blooded murder of my only child, as if they were simply planning a relaxing weekend vacation. "It is brilliant, darling," Stephanie, he cooed softly, gently stroking the dark lapel of his tailored charcoal overcoat. "And our timing could not possibly be more perfect. Everything is aligning exactly as we meticulously planned from the very beginning. Monday morning is the final glorious phase of our operation. The medical transport team will arrive right at dawn to take the miserable little brat directly to the maximum security psychiatric asylum. With my beautifully fabricated evidence and your official licensed medical evaluation declaring her a violent, unhinged danger to society, the court will permanently strip away her legal rights. The presiding judge will officially transfer the sole uncontested administrative control of her massive $10 million trust fund directly into our waiting hands." Harrison smiled warmly, pressing a tender, lingering kiss against her forehead. "And what about our dear sleeping patient?" he asked smoothly, gesturing vaguely toward my comatose son. Stephanie pulled back slightly, her dark eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated psychopathic greed. "Tuesday," she stated with absolute chilling certainty. "Tuesday is the grand finale. Once the $10 million from Lily's trust is fully secured and legally combined with Matthew's primary $15 million estate portfolio, we simply double his daily chemical dose. You will mix the final highly concentrated lethal vial for me. I will slip it into his evening tea. His weakened cardiovascular system will completely buckle under the massive toxic strain. He will suffer a catastrophic fatal stroke in his sleep. I will wake up on Wednesday morning, play the role of the devastated grieving widow for the local authorities, and seamlessly inherit every single penny of his $25 million fortune. By the end of the month, we will be sitting on a private balcony in Switzerland, drinking expensive champagne and laughing at how incredibly easy it was to outsmart a supposedly brilliant family." The audio feed continued to broadcast their sickening, triumphant laughter, but I could no longer hear it over the deafening, roaring thunder of my own racing heartbeat. I sat perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of my private study, completely surrounded by the pale, glowing monitors, as a profound, agonizing wave of absolute heartbreak washed heavily over my soul. I looked at the digital image of my son, a strong, vibrant man who had dedicated his entire adult life to healing others, now violently reduced to a helpless, dying hostage inside his own home. I thought about my innocent, terrified granddaughter, maliciously marked for a lifetime of institutionalized psychological torture simply because she possessed a lucrative inheritance. The sheer overwhelming magnitude of their calculated evil threatened to shatter my sanity entirely. They had weaponized deep personal trust manipulated the rigid boundaries of the law, and perverted the sacred medical oath to flawlessly orchestrate a brutal double homicide solely for immense financial gain. I slowly reached out and turned the volume dial back down, completely silencing their vile, arrogant voices forever. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep, shuddering breath, allowing the raw, agonizing grief of a devastated father to fully wash through my tired, aging bones. I permitted myself exactly one solitary minute to deeply mourn the terrible betrayal of my family, to mourn the horrifying silent suffering inflicted upon the people I loved most in this entire world. But when I finally opened my eyes and looked back at the glowing high-definition screens, the grieving, broken father was completely gone. In his place sat the cold, calculating, and ruthlessly objective Superior Court judge. For 40 years, I had sat high above crowded, tense courtrooms, staring down directly into the eyes of violent murderers, greedy extortionists, and remorseless, violent predators. I had dedicated my entire professional existence to carefully analyzing complex, layered criminal conspiracies and delivering absolute, unyielding justice to those arrogant individuals who foolishly believed they were entirely untouchable. Stephanie and Harrison genuinely believed they had orchestrated the perfect, untraceable crime. They thought their flawless medical assassination and brilliant legal manipulations made them invincible. But they had made the ultimate fatal mistake of leaving a perfectly clear, digitally recorded trail of their entire murderous conspiracy. I reached for my secure mobile phone, my hand no longer trembling with sorrow, but perfectly steady with the dark, lethal promise of absolute retribution. The long, agonizing, silent trial was officially over. The undeniable physical evidence was securely gathered, and I was now fully prepared to finally step out of the shadows and personally execute the ultimate sentence upon the two arrogant monsters who foolishly dared to target my innocent family. The freezing sunlight of Sunday morning pierced through the heavy oak blinds of my study, casting long, pale shadows across the mahogany desk. I had not slept a single wink. My mind was a steel trap perfectly calibrated and ready to snap shut. I picked up my mobile phone, cleared the harshness from my throat, and dialed my son's house. Stephanie answered on the second ring, her voice coated in that familiar, sickly sweet layer of artificial concern. I closed my eyes and delivered the final performance of my life. I let my voice waver, injecting it with the profound, exhausting defeat of a broken old man who had simply run out of options. I told her that I had spent the entire weekend watching Lily, and I was deeply horrified to admit that she was right all along. I told her that my granddaughter was entirely unmanageable, a severe danger to herself, and that I could no longer protect her from the psychiatric help she so desperately needed. I could practically hear the arrogant, victorious smirk forming on her face through the receiver. She offered a soft, breathy sigh of relief, thanking me for finally seeing the tragic reality of their situation. I then asked her to bring Matthew and Dr. Harrison Reed to my home that afternoon, so we could privately sign the final irreversible institutionalization paperwork together as a family. She agreed without a single second of hesitation, her boundless greed completely blinding her to the executioner waiting patiently in the shadows. I spent the next several hours preparing my sprawling living room with the meticulous, exacting precision of a judge setting the stage for a highly publicized trial. I arranged the heavy leather armchairs in a tight semicircle facing the massive flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace. I brewed a pot of incredibly expensive, rare imported tea, arranging the delicate porcelain cups on a silver tray. Every single detail was designed to project an atmosphere of wealthy, aristocratic surrender. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent house. I walked slowly down the corridor, adjusting the lapels of my dark suit, and pulled the heavy door open. Stephanie stood on my snow-covered porch, looking absolutely radiant, in a dark tailored trench coat, clutching a thick leather folder against her chest. Dr. Harrison Reed stood tall and confident, right beside her, projecting the flawless, authoritative aura of a deeply concerned medical professional. Between them stood my son. Matthew looked even worse than he had at the police precinct. He was leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his breathing ragged, his skin a terrifying shade of translucent gray. They were practically dragging him across the threshold. I stepped aside, offering a weak, defeated nod, as I welcomed the architects of my family's destruction directly into my home. I guided them into the warmth of the living room, gesturing for them to sit in the carefully arranged leather chairs. Stephanie guided Matthew to the closest seat, aggressively hovering over him to ensure he remained upright. Harrison took the armchair directly across from me, crossing his long legs and folding his hands together with a deeply practiced look of profound medical empathy. William Harrison began, his voice smooth and incredibly soothing. I want you to know how deeply sorry I am that it has come to this. Making the incredibly difficult decision to institutionalize a family member is a heartbreaking burden, but you are doing the absolute right thing for Lily's long-term health. I simply nodded, keeping my face entirely devoid of the violent volcanic rage threatening to erupt from my chest. I picked up the heavy silver teapot and slowly poured the steaming, fragrant liquid into their porcelain cups. Stephanie eagerly opened her thick leather folder, pulling out the dense stacks of legal documents and placing a sleek silver pen on the glass coffee table between us. We have all the necessary transfer authorizations right here, William, she murmured softly, her dark eyes flashing with barely concealed triumphant greed. Once you sign your guarantor release, Harrison will sign the medical endorsement, and Matthew will authorize the final emergency trust transition. It will all be over very soon, and we can finally start healing. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not look at the fraudulent legal documents she had so proudly laid out before me. Instead, I calmly picked up my porcelain teacup, took a slow, measured sip of the hot liquid, and gently placed it back onto the silver tray. I looked directly into Stephanie's eyes, then shifted my cold, unyielding gaze to the arrogant psychiatrist sitting beside her. You are absolutely right, Stephanie, I said, my voice dropping the fragile, defeated tone and instantly adopting the resonant, commanding baritone of a superior court judge. It will all be over very soon. I reached my hand deep into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out the small black digital remote control for the television system. I saw a brief, incredibly faint flicker of confusion cross Harrison's confident face. I did not give them a single second to question my actions. I firmly pressed the central power button. The massive screen mounted above the roaring stone fireplace instantly flickered to life. It did not display a blank screen or a news channel. It immediately broadcast the crystal-clear, high-definition, hidden camera footage captured directly from their own master bedroom just 3 days prior. The hidden audio system I had wired through the living room speakers blasted their own sickening, arrogant voices into the quiet space. The room was instantly filled with the crisp, undeniable sound of Stephanie and Harrison intimately kissing over my sedated son. The digital recording played their horrifying, cold-blooded conversation with devastating, echoing clarity. The speakers projected Harrison boasting about his untraceable lethal thallium cocktail. The speakers projected Stephanie laughing wickedly about locking my terrified granddaughter in a psychiatric asylum. The speakers projected their explicit, premeditated plan to double Matthew's toxic dosage on Tuesday, murder him in his sleep, and flee the country with $25 million in stolen assets. The dramatic, instantaneous shift in the atmosphere of my living room was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Stephanie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The delicate porcelain teacup violently slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering into dozens of jagged pieces against the hardwood floor, sending hot liquid pooling around her expensive designer boots. Harrison went as perfectly rigid as a stone statue, the arrogant professional color draining entirely from his face until he looked like a panicked, trapped animal. I stood up slowly from my leather armchair, buttoning my suit jacket with absolute calm. I watched the terrifying reality of their situation completely crash down upon them, destroying their arrogant illusions. They had walked into my home expecting to steal a massive fortune and secure their freedom. Instead, they had walked blindly into an inescapable prison cell. I looked down at them, feeling a profound sense of cold delivering justice. Before anyone in the room could ever utter a single word, to fully break the suffocating silence, the heavy oak front doors of my mansion were violently kicked open. The deafening crash echoed through the sprawling foyer as a heavily armed tactical police team flooded into the living room. Their dark tactical gear and leveled weapons contrasted sharply against my elegant decor. Leading the charge was Chief of Police David Miller, a man I had mentored decades ago. He stepped forward with a grim, uncompromising expression, his eyes locking instantly onto the two terrified perpetrators sitting on my leather furniture. The metallic click of heavy handcuffs echoed sharply over the roaring flames of the fireplace as two large officers forcefully grabbed Harrison and slammed him face first against the hardwood floor. He offered absolutely no resistance, his arrogant medical demeanor completely dissolving into the pathetic whimpering of a defeated coward. Another officer roughly hauled Stephanie to her feet, violently twisting her arms behind her back and snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around her slender wrists. She began to thrash and kick wildly, her pristine tailored trench coat twisting tightly around her legs as she let out loud, hysterical screams. She begged my son to save her, crying out that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. Matthew simply sat there, blinking slowly through his dense chemical fog, watching his wicked wife being dragged away like a common street criminal. I stepped slowly around the glass coffee table and stopped mere inches from where Stephanie was struggling violently against the arresting officers. The hysterical screaming immediately died in her throat when she looked up and met my dead, unyielding gaze. I looked down at her, my voice slicing through the chaotic room with the surgical precision of a final judicial ruling. "You arrogant, foolish woman," I said quietly, ensuring every single syllable resonated with absolute certainty in the quiet room. "You genuinely believed that your pretty face and your psychopathic charm could completely outsmart a man who spent 40 years dismantling criminal empires. You weaponized my innocent granddaughter, you poisoned my only son, and you perverted the law to steal a massive fortune you did not earn. But you made the ultimate fatal error of leaving a clear digital trail of your entire murderous conspiracy." I paused, allowing the gravity of her total failure to crush her arrogant spirit completely, forever. "For the charges of attempted premeditated murder, severe child endangerment, financial fraud, and medical malpractice, the state of Illinois will ensure that you and your pathetic accomplice never see the outside of a maximum security prison cell for the rest of your miserable lives. I will personally guarantee that you receive consecutive life sentences without the slightest possibility of parole." I turned my back on her and nodded to Chief Miller. He gave a swift hand gesture, and the officers dragged the sobbing, broken woman out of my home, tossing her into the back of a waiting police transport vehicle. The deafening wail of the police sirens quickly faded into the freezing Chicago snowstorm, leaving behind a sudden, profound, and heavy silence in my living room. I immediately turned my attention to my son. I knelt beside his chair, wrapping my arms tightly around his trembling, frail body, and promised him that the terrible nightmare was officially over. I told him we were going to get him the best medical help in the world, and that our broken family was finally going to heal. He buried his face in my shoulder, weeping silently as the toxic fog began to lift. 6 months have completely passed since that terrifying Sunday afternoon. The harsh, freezing winter has fully surrendered to a bright, warm, and beautiful summer season. The legal proceedings moved with unprecedented speed, entirely fueled by the undeniable high-definition video evidence Benjamin and his tactical team had gathered. Stephanie and Harrison both pleaded guilty immediately to avoid a lengthy, humiliating public trial. They are currently serving consecutive life sentences in separate maximum security state penitentiaries, completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their professional medical licenses, and their freedom forever. The justice system worked exactly as it was perfectly designed today. My son, Matthew, spent 4 grueling, agonizing months in an intensive inpatient rehabilitation and detoxification facility. Removing the toxic heavy metal from his bloodstream was an incredibly painful ordeal. But he fought through those terrible medical withdrawals with the fierce, unrelenting determination of a man who had been given a miraculous second chance at life. He is now completely clean, his brilliant mind is sharp again, and he is slowly returning to his prestigious surgical practice. The dark, hollow circles under his eyes have entirely vanished, replaced by a profound, humbling gratitude for the family he very nearly lost forever. Lily is thriving beautifully in her new, peaceful environment. The massive trust fund remains completely untouched and perfectly secure, safely, waiting for her 25th birthday, just as her mother originally intended. She is no longer terrified of closed doors or dark rooms. She has happily returned to painting, capturing the bright, vibrant colors of the world, instead of hiding from its terrifying shadows. Her beautiful laughter constantly fills the spacious halls of my home, bringing a renewed sense of pure joy to a space that was once overshadowed by deep, lingering grief. I am incredibly proud of her strength. I am sitting quietly on a weathered wooden bench, looking out over the calm blue waters of Lake Michigan. The warm afternoon sun reflects brilliantly off the gentle rolling waves, creating a spectacular shimmering golden glow. A few yards away, Matthew and Lily are laughing together, tossing a bright yellow tennis ball to a golden retriever we adopted last month. I watch them play, a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settling over my tired, aging heart. I had to step back into the dark, ruthless world of criminal justice one final time, but the reward was completely worth it. I saved my beloved family from the terrible clutches of pure evil, and I secured their bright future with the unyielding strength of a protective grandfather who simply refused to ever surrender. The world can be a dark, treacherous place filled with greedy, manipulative monsters. But as long as I have breath left in my lungs, I will always be the impenetrable shield that stands firmly between my family and the darkness. I take a deep, refreshing breath of the clean lake air, letting the wonderful warmth of the sun wash over my face. I look at my son today, knowing that the absolute worst chapter of our lives is permanently closed. Brings me an immeasurable amount of comfort. We bravely survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged much stronger, closer, and entirely unbreakable as a unified family. The dark, violent storm has finally passed, and the beautiful warm light has permanently returned to our family forever. I close my eyes, listening to the wonderful sound of their distant laughter echoing across the sandy beach. It is the perfect, harmonious sound of true, absolute victory. I smile softly, knowing my lifelong pursuit of justice is now completely and beautifully finished forever. Family is not just defined by those who sleep under the same roof, because sometimes the darkest monsters wear the mask of a loving spouse. We often blind ourselves to the truth because the harsh reality of betrayal is simply too painful to accept. But true love requires absolute vigilance every single day. When a person's actions consistently contradict their sweet words, you must trust your gut and never their empty excuses. Money can buy a flawless reputation and a beautiful smile, but it can never outsmart the fierce, unbreakable instincts of a family's true protector. Justice always demands light. Have you ever uncovered a dark secret someone close to you was trying to hide? How did you expose? Share your story in the comments below. If this grandfather's fight for justice kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more today.